the program at all. We are a tad bit on the later side, we're a little behind. And please, if you have paid attention, you've obviously spotted our air on there. We are not going to keep you till 9 o'clock. Don't be worried about that. We will be out by 8, 8:30, but nothing as late as 9. But without that, I need to speed things along. We are going to start off tonight with our entertainment. And it is my honor to introduce our speech and debate president and one of our main captains, one of our main competitors, Mr. Jacob Adams. Would everyone please give him a round of applause? Now, Jacob here is going to be explaining his event, and then he's going to be performing it in front of you, so enjoy.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction, Mitch. The event that I'm about to show all of you is called Expository Speaking. If you think of speech and debate as several different groups of events, we have our acting events, we have our debate events, we have our speech events. This is one of these speech events. Basically what expository is you write a 10-minute speech about some subject that you choose, basically just exploring that subject, and then you memorize it and you make boards about it and then you present it. So we usually present it with the aid of a stand because of some technical difficulties, i.e. I lost my stand in my room. I'm just going to be using this chair, so if you just use your powers of imagination to imagine that I have a stand, then everything will work. And so without further ado, I would like to present my expository speech. I'm about to show you one of the most mysterious things in the entire universe. It's mysterious because its presence is often unknown, and because it often comes when we least expect it. The only way we can identify it is this: when it exists, we don't. I'm talking about death. Now, death is something people don't like to talk about very much, but that's a shame, because there's a great deal about death that deserves to be explored. And that is what we're going to do today. Today we're going to look at death in 4 different ways. First, by looking at how various cultures view death. Second, by looking at some of the questions that still surround death. Third, by looking at what science has to say about death. And fourth, by looking at efforts that are being taken to make death as far away as it can possibly be. Now, it's interesting to think that in many cultures, death isn't viewed so much as a condition as it is a being with thoughts and feelings and actions. Now, in the US, most of us are pretty familiar with the general European depiction of death as the Grim Reaper, but other cultures depict death in some very interesting ways. For example, to the Jews, death is the angel of death, a mysterious being with 12 wings who kills people by flinging a drop of gall into their throats. To the Hindus, death is Yama, the god of the underworld, who kills people by hitting them with his mace, roping them with his noose, and then dragging them down to his kingdom. And then finally there's the skeleton baby, who is not a symbol of death in any known culture, but it was rather just an attempt to make you like the speech by putting something so cute in it. Now, if I asked you what you thought death was, what would you say? You'd probably say something like, death is when your heart stops beating and your lungs stop breathing. And that's what people believed for most of the history of the world. But in the 18th century, one word shattered that nice little image of death, and that word was resuscitation. People like William Taussig, the inventor of mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, which forms a large part of what we now call CPR, were showing that stopped hearts could be restarted, and that lungs that didn't breathe could be made to. And when people saw these things happening, they were amazed. It looked like people were being brought back from the dead. And so they went to science for an explanation. But unfortunately, science couldn't give them one. There were still some basic questions surrounding resuscitation that back then people didn't know the answers to. For example, were people actually being brought back from the dead? If not, was it just their heart and lungs hadn't stopped, they were just performing at a low level, so you could still bring them back, they were still alive? Or if it was true that people's heart and lungs actually did stop, but that they weren't dead, then what was the difference between a living person with a heart and lungs that didn't work and a dead person with a heart and lungs that didn't work? So people began to become very worried, and doctors began to lose confidence in their own ability to tell whether someone was living or dead. Now just think about that for a second. If doctors start worrying about something like that, everyone starts worrying. It was so much so that throughout much of the 18th and 19th centuries, the 2 words on everyone's lips were premature burial. People were afraid that if they fell into a coma or something, they might be misdiagnosed as dead and they might get buried when they were actually still alive. Now, as you might think, people tried to come up with ways to make sure this wouldn't happen to them. Among the various ways people came up with were, for example, some people wrote in their wills that if they were diagnosed as dead, they wanted to be cremated, or also to have all their blood drawn out, so that even if they weren't dead when they were diagnosed as dead, they'd at least be dead when they were put in the ground. And there were some people, who I suppose you'd call the more adventurous types, who really weren't afraid of being buried alive. They just wanted to have a way out if it happened to them. These people would install bells above their graves. I'll tell you how it would work. If you imagine the grave as being right here, and here's the person buried under it, on top of it you'd have a tower. And then connected to the top of the tower is a bell. And running down from that bell you'd have a rope. And the rope would go down through the tower, through the ground, into the hand of the person who's buried, so that if for some weird reason they wake up after being buried, they can yank on the rope, the bell will ring, and they'll be saved. If there happens to be someone sitting right next to their grave when they ring the bell. Eventually, though, doctors realized that they should do something about not knowing anything about when someone was actually dead. So, in 1969, a group of incredibly brainy doctors from Harvard University came together to decide what the formal medical definition of death should be. The definition they eventually settled on had nothing to do with whether someone's heart and lungs were working at the moment, but with whether their brain lost the ability to make them work. Basically, if your brain is performing at so low a level that you can't think, can't eat, and can't breathe or have a pulse without being hooked up to a machine, then you're dead. This is called being brain dead. And by the way, the use of this term to refer to most members of the US Congress is a complete and total coincidence. But anyway, even though we now know what death is, there's still some basic questions surrounding death that we don't know the answers to. For example, the death penalty. Now, in many cultures, death has traditionally been used as a punishment for very serious crimes, especially murder. But the question is it moral to kill someone to show people that killing is wrong? And if so, is there a most moral way to kill someone? For example, is guillotining someone better than hanging them? Or is lethal injection better than the electric chair? Another issue that's been discussed a great deal, especially in recent years, is the question of assisted suicide. Now, most people would agree that if a person is suffering from a terminal illness, which is an illness that is killing them, and they can only survive if they're hooked up to life support, then they have the right to ask the doctor to take them off life support if they want. But the question is, if someone is suffering from a terminal illness that isn't killing them right now, but that's still causing them unbearable pain, do they have the right to ask a doctor to kill them? And finally, and most importantly, am I justified in killing someone who's lived way past her usefulness? Eventually, though, these questions may become less and less important as we find ways to make death further and further away. There's one organization in particular called SENS, which stands for Strategies for Engineering Negligible Senescence, which is a big fancy way of saying ways to make sure people don't age as much, that is trying to get rid of aging, which according to founder Dr. Aubrey de Grey is the cause of about 90% of all deaths. The SENS strategy is to get